After 20 years of marriage, Margaret Lawson was blindsided. She thought she knew her husband, Robert, better than anyone. But on a Tuesday evening at Giovanni's, their favorite restaurant, the man she had spent half her life with dropped a bombshell that shattered everything. "I need space," Robert said, his voice cold and detached, like it was just another mundane decision to be made. There was no emotion in his words, no hint of the man she once knew. Margaret's heart sank as she realized that the man she loved for 2 decades was no longer the person sitting across from her. The timing couldn't have been worse. Margaret was battling stage 2 breast cancer, a diagnosis she had received only a few weeks earlier. But Robert wasn't there for her. Instead, he was distant, lost in his own world. Margaret had been holding on to the hope that their love and shared history would keep them together through this difficult time. But now it seemed like Robert had already checked out. 20 years isn't working anymore, he said, his words cold as he looked away, staring at the condensation on his glass. Margaret didn't ask for details. She didn't need to. She already knew. But there was one thing she hadn't expected. She hadn't expected what would happen next. Margaret had always been there for Robert. For 20 years, she supported his career, his dreams, and his ambitions. They had built a life together, one that looked perfect on the outside, but was crumbling beneath the surface. She gave up her own desires to help him climb the corporate ladder, managing their home, social obligations, and family life while he focused on his work. She had sacrificed her own career, put her dreams of starting a business on hold, and spent countless hours at charity events, dinners, and social gatherings. All the while, Robert's career flourished. His promotions, his rise through the firm, his long hours all became their shared goal. But as Robert's success grew, so did the distance between them. The signs had always been there. Robert's sudden obsession with his appearance, his new designer suits, the gym membership he actually started using, and the cologne that smelled foreign to Margaret, all of these were little clues that something was changing. Margaret had been too busy managing the life they had built to pay attention to the subtle shifts. She made excuses for him, telling herself that his long work hours were just a phase. She believed it was just the stress of his new position. She was wrong. Their conversations grew shorter, more superficial. His criticisms of her became sharper, and he spent more and more time on his phone, even during their rare dinners together. The once comforting moments they shared were replaced by awkward silences and disconnected glances. Margaret was still doing everything she had always done, but it wasn't enough anymore. She had noticed the changes, but she convinced herself that they could still fix things. After all, they had built a life together, hadn't they? But as she sat in her kitchen that night, after hearing the words "I need space," she realized something she couldn't ignore anymore. She wasn't the woman Robert had married. She had become a part of his life he could easily push aside. For the discovery didn't come all at once. At first, it was small things: a missed dinner, a text message with a name that didn't make sense, and then the lipstick stain. Margaret had always prided herself on being observant, but when it came to Robert, she had turned a blind eye. She was too focused on managing her health, her treatment, and her role in their life to notice the growing distance between them. But the lipstick stain was impossible to ignore. It wasn't hers, and it wasn't a mark she had seen before. Margaret's heart sank and her stomach twisted. She remembered a time when Robert's cologne was something that could make her smile, but now it was a constant reminder that he had become a stranger. She didn't confront him immediately. She wasn't ready for that, not yet. But the clues kept adding up: the late-night calls he took in the garage, the expensive gifts he bought for Jessica, his secretary, and the way he flinched whenever she touched him. She had become a ghost in their home. It wasn't just the affair that hurt. It was the fact that Robert had stopped pretending. He had stopped pretending to care, to love her, and to care about their life together. Every day felt like a reminder that she was being left behind, that she wasn't part of the life they had built anymore. Then came the credit card statement. Margaret didn't need to look hard to find the evidence. There it was in black and white: charges for restaurants she had never heard of, jewelry stores, and vacations to places she had never visited. All of it pointed back to Robert and Jessica. The final blow came when Margaret finally asked, "Is there someone else?" Her voice was steady, though her heart was breaking. Robert's hesitation was all the answer she needed. "Jessica," he confessed, his voice barely a whisper. "It just happened." Just like that, he reduced their 20 years together to something that had just happened. No apologies, no remorse. Just a statement, as if their entire marriage had been a mere footnote in his pursuit of happiness with someone else. Margaret's world tilted on its axis. But she wasn't going to let Robert see how deeply his betrayal had wounded her. Not yet. Instead, she silently placed her napkin down, stood up, and walked out of Giovanni's. She was done. Her heart was broken, but her resolve was stronger than ever. The divorce papers arrived exactly 1 week after Margaret walked out of Giovanni's. Robert had wasted no time. The papers weren't even from his own law firm, they came from a divorce specialist he had hired. Everything was already decided. The home would be sold, their assets divided, and the personal property itemized with chilling precision. The process was sterile, businesslike, as if Robert were settling a routine transaction. Margaret sat at her kitchen counter, the envelope unopened for hours. Her fingers hovered over the seal as the weight of the decision and the finality of Robert's actions pressed down on her. She could feel her heart racing, the anger and hurt bubbling to the surface, but she refused to let it control her. Robert had thought he could take everything from her, including her dignity, but Margaret was no longer the woman who had stood silently by his side for years. She opened the envelope slowly, the coldness of the paperwork contrasting with the warmth of the memories she had once cherished. As she read the details, she felt a quiet sense of power growing inside her. Robert had tried to erase everything they had built together. But there was one thing he hadn't counted on: Margaret's strength. She didn't immediately call a lawyer. She didn't shout or cry. Instead, she signed the papers. She agreed to everything he wanted, without hesitation. But what Robert didn't know was that this was her strategy. She wasn't surrendering. She was biding her time, waiting for the right moment to strike. When she sent the signed papers back to his lawyer, she did so with the quiet knowledge that this wasn't the end. She was playing the long game. And in that moment, Margaret knew that her fight for justice was just beginning. "Are you sure about this?" her sister, Claire, asked over the phone after Margaret's decision to sign the papers. Margaret hesitated before answering. "It's not defeat, Claire, it's strategy. He thinks he's won, but he hasn't seen anything yet." As Margaret moved forward with the divorce, she felt the weight of her decision heavy on her shoulders. But little did she know, a twist was waiting for her, a twist that would change everything. 2 days after she had sent back the signed divorce papers, Margaret received a call from George Mitchell, her father-in-law. George had always been a quiet, dignified man, someone who had treated Margaret like a daughter since her own mother had passed away. They had shared many lunches together over the years, their talks filled with wisdom and compassion. "Margaret, I think it's time we had a talk," George said, his voice serious. "I've been meaning to tell you something for a while now, but I didn't know how." Margaret was taken aback. She had just started to process the pain of the divorce, and now George wanted to share something important. She sat down, her heart racing. Was he going to tell her something about Robert? When they met for lunch, George wasted no time. "I made a change to my will a few years ago," he said, looking directly at Margaret. "And I think you need to know about it." Margaret was stunned. George explained that he had added a clause to his will, a clause that Robert had never bothered to read. According to this clause, if Robert ever divorced Margaret without clear evidence of her infidelity, he would forfeit his entire inheritance. Everything. The family business, the lake house in Vermont, and a substantial estate, all of it would go to Margaret. "Why would you do that?" Margaret whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. George sighed deeply, his expression softening with regret. "I watched Robert take you for granted over the years. He never appreciated you the way he should have, and I knew that one day he'd throw you away for someone younger, someone more convenient for his career. I wanted to make sure that if he did, he'd lose everything. And it's not just for the money. It's because I believe you deserve better, Margaret. You deserve respect." Margaret sat back, processing this revelation. It felt like a sudden shift in her reality. She had been betrayed, yes, but now she realized that Robert's betrayal was not just a personal affront. It was part of a larger picture, one that had been carefully planned by someone who loved her. For the first time in a long while, Margaret felt a surge of strength. She wasn't just a woman who had been abandoned. She was someone with the power to change everything. And now, with George's will as her secret weapon, she was about to take back control of her life. Margaret's mind was made up. She had to act, and she would do it on her own terms. No more waiting, no more being the invisible wife. It was time to take control of her future, and Robert had no idea what was coming. As her radiation treatments continued, Margaret focused on regaining her physical strength. Each session, while draining, was a reminder that she was fighting for her life not just against cancer, but also against the betrayal that had turned her world upside down. Margaret spent hours planning her next move. She called on her closest allies, her sister Claire, her old mentor Judith, and even her former law firm. She started working on securing her financial future, hiring an advisor to help her navigate what would come next. Margaret wasn't just surviving, she was rebuilding. One afternoon, while driving home from the hospital, Claire brought up something Margaret hadn't considered: her last name. "You've been Margaret Mitchell for 28 years, Claire said carefully, "but before that you were Margaret Jenkins. Why not go back to that name? It's yours, after all." Margaret paused, the idea settling into her mind. She had given up so much of herself over the years, but reclaiming her maiden name felt like reclaiming a piece of who she used to be: a woman with dreams and identity beyond Robert. The very next day, Margaret visited the courthouse. The paperwork felt empowering as she asked the clerk to restore her name. "Margaret Jenkins," the clerk said as she stamped the form. It wasn't just paperwork, it was Margaret's first act of defiance. With that, Margaret decided she was done hiding behind the shadows of her failed marriage. She wasn't just going to be a passive participant in her own life anymore. And then came the Instagram post. Margaret was scrolling through her feed when she saw it: Robert, his secretary Jessica, smiling at a table in an exclusive restaurant. A photo of the engagement ring with the caption, "We said yes." That ring, it was familiar. Margaret recognized it instantly. It had once belonged to her grandmother, a piece of jewelry Robert had always dismissed as outdated. But now Jessica was wearing it, proudly displaying it for the world to see. The engagement was fast, much faster than anyone expected after their divorce. Margaret felt a cold anger rising in her chest. But it wasn't just the engagement that hurt, it was the fact that Robert had moved on so quickly, trying to erase her from the picture completely. But Margaret had one more card to play. Robert didn't know it yet, but everything he thought he had secured was about to slip away from him. The moment had arrived. Margaret had spent weeks planning for this confrontation, and she was ready. She had never felt stronger, more in control. Her cancer treatments had ended, her finances were in order, and she had made peace with the life she was about to rebuild. But the final step required one last act of bravery, one last face-to-face meeting with Robert. The location was set: Lakeview Cottage, the family vacation home in Vermont, the very place where Robert had proposed to Margaret all those years ago, the place where they had once dreamed of a future together. It was fitting that it would be here where everything had started, that everything would end. As Margaret drove up the winding road toward the cottage, her thoughts weren't filled with anger or bitterness. No, this wasn't about that. It was about justice, about reclaiming the years she had lost, about standing tall in front of the man who had betrayed her, and about making sure he understood the full extent of what he had done. When Margaret arrived, Robert was already there, standing outside, looking a bit out of place in his business suit. He hadn't expected this. He had expected a quiet meeting to finalize the division of assets, maybe some awkward silence, and certainly no confrontation. But Margaret wasn't there to beg or plead. "I didn't expect you to show up," Robert said, his voice uncertain, as though the situation was already slipping from his grasp. Margaret walked up to him, holding the manila envelope that would change everything. "You didn't think I'd come, did you?" she said, her voice steady but filled with quiet power. "You thought you could leave me with nothing. But I'm not the woman you left behind anymore." Margaret handed him the envelope. Robert took it, confused, as he flipped it open. His eyes widened as he saw the contents: George Mitchell's will. The clause that Robert had never bothered to read was now in black and white. "I knew about the will," Margaret said, her gaze unwavering. "What you didn't know was that George foresaw everything. He knew what you'd do, and he made sure you'd lose everything if you ever treated me like this." Robert's face drained of color as he read the clause. His mouth opened in disbelief, but no words came out. "You thought you could erase me," Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger. "You thought you could walk away with your new life and leave me with nothing. But now, I hold the power, Robert. You never read the fine print, and now you'll pay the price for underestimating me." The silence between them stretched long, and in that moment Margaret knew she had won not just the battle for her inheritance, but the battle for her own self-worth. Robert's world, built on lies and betrayal, was crumbling before him. Margaret felt no joy in his discomfort, but she couldn't deny the satisfaction of seeing him face the consequences of his actions. She turned to leave, her heart full of quiet triumph. "I don't need your money, Robert. What I need is my freedom, and I'm finally getting it." Margaret left the cottage with her head held high. She wasn't the broken woman who had walked into that marriage all those years ago. She was stronger, wiser, and ready to reclaim her life. As she drove away, Margaret realized that she had done more than take revenge on Robert. She had freed herself from the past. She was no longer defined by him or their broken marriage. She was Margaret Lawson once more, and she was ready to start the next chapter of her life. Margaret's journey wasn't just about getting even with Robert. It was about finding her own strength in the face of betrayal. It was about reclaiming her identity and her future, when everything she thought she knew had been ripped away. The truth is, we all face moments in life when we're tested, when things seem impossible, when the people we trust the most let us down. But it's in those moments that we can choose to stand tall, to fight back, and to rebuild. Margaret's story is a reminder that, no matter how difficult the journey, we have the power to reclaim our lives, our dignity, and our happiness. Don't let anyone define your worth. And when you face betrayal, remember you can rise from it, stronger than before. If you've ever been betrayed or felt like you've lost everything, remember Margaret's story. The fight isn't always about getting revenge, it's about getting your life back. Like, share, and comment if you believe in second chances. Remember, your story is yours to rewrite.
The moment her hand hit my face, everything stopped. To clink of silverware, the soft jazz playing in the background, the murmurs from the other tables, it all vanished into silence. I didn't speak. I didn't move. I just stood there, stunned, staring at my stepmother as her wine glass trembled in her other hand. "You're just like your mother," she hissed, leaning in with venom laced behind every word. The only other sound I could hear was my heart pounding in my chest and my father quietly slicing into his steak, pretending none of it had happened. No shock, no protest, not even a glance in my direction, just silence. I turned away from the table, from the sea of frozen expressions and awkward stares, and walked out of the restaurant into the Portland night. No one followed. I didn't cry in the car. I didn't call a friend. I didn't scream or throw things or demand justice. I just sat there in my coat, staring at the steering wheel, feeling something I hadn't felt in a long time: stillness. And then something shifted. Not loudly, but like the soft snap of a thread that had been pulled too tightly for too long. By the time they arrived home from the dinner, tipsy and full of their own narrative, I was already there waiting. So was someone else. And on the coffee table sat a thick folder filled with truths they had spent years trying to bury. This wasn't about revenge. It was about finally saying what had never been said and daring them to listen. My name is Olivia Miles. I'm 34 now, but I was 29 when that dinner changed everything. I live in Portland, Oregon. I work in publishing, mostly behind the scenes, editing manuscripts, helping other people find the right words. Funny, isn't it? How it's always been easier to help others tell their stories than to speak my own. I don't talk to my family much. That's not bitterness, it's survival. I keep a polite distance. Birthday texts, the occasional forwarded article from my father with no message, just a headline he thought I'd find interesting. It's been this way for years, and for the most part, I'm fine with it. I didn't go home often. In fact, before that night, I hadn't been back in over a year. It wasn't really home anymore, not since my mother passed away and everything changed. She died when I was 16, ovarian cancer. It was long, painful, and unforgiving. My dad, Robert, was a shell of himself after that. At the time, I told myself to be understanding, that he was grieving, that people cope differently. I told myself that for years. But what I could never fully understand was how quickly he brought someone else into our lives. Her name was Vanessa. She was his former coworker, a financial consultant who seemed to know everything and expected everyone else to fall in line. She moved into our home less than a year after my mom died. She brought structure, order, control, and she brought her daughter, Haley. What followed were years of walking on eggshells, trying to please someone who had no interest in being pleased, at least not by me. And when my father stood by silent and compliant, I knew I was on my own. So I left. I built a life. I worked. I paid my own way, and I stayed far enough away to avoid getting pulled back in. Until that dinner invitation arrived, and against every instinct I had, I said yes. To understand what happened that night, you have to understand what led up to it. When my mother died, everything in our house changed. Not just because she was gone, but because someone else stepped in so quickly, so seamlessly. It was like she'd been waiting in the wings the whole time. Vanessa was polished, calm, the type of woman who always knew exactly where to place the salad fork and how to make a child feel like they were being difficult for having an opinion. At first, it was little things. She reorganized the kitchen, repainted the walls, donated half of my mom's belongings without asking. I was still 16, still reeling from the loss, but no one seemed to care. Reef had a schedule in our house, and I was behind. Then she started deciding bigger things: what I should wear, how I should behave in public, which colleges I should apply to. She said I needed structure. What I needed was space to breathe. But in Vanessa's world, control was love, and resistance was disrespect. She told my father I was being moody, dramatic, that my grief was unhealthy, that I needed therapy and not the gentle kind, but fix-her therapy. He believed her. Not because she was right, but because it was easier than facing his own guilt, easier than challenging the only person who seemed capable of holding his life together after Mom. Vanessa had a daughter, Haley. She was 5 years younger than me, soft-spoken, eager to please. She called Vanessa Mom and got dessert seconds. I was the outsider, the reminder, the problem child. We were never close. How could we be? We were pitted against each other from day one. Everything I said was scrutinized, everything Haley said was praised. I learned to keep quiet, to shrink myself. And my father, he let it happen. I used to tell myself he was grieving, that he was lost. But as the years passed, that excuse wore thin. The worst part? It wasn't the yelling. Vanessa didn't need to yell. Her sharpest weapon was her calm, her ability to make you doubt yourself while never raising her voice. She could make you feel ungrateful for asking a question, dramatic for stating a fact. I tried to fight back once, just once. I told her she was crossing a line, that I missed my mother, that I wasn't ready for someone else to take over. She smiled. Then she told my father I was unstable, that I was punishing him for moving on. And he, once again, said nothing. That was the moment I realized the house I had grown up in was no longer mine. So I did the only thing I could, I left. When I left for college, I didn't look back. I got a scholarship to a state university 6 hours away and moved into a dorm with nothing but 2 suitcases and a deep sense of relief. For the first time in years, I could breathe without tiptoeing. I worked hard. I studied harder. I paid my own rent, got internships, waited tables in the evenings. I built a life where no one questioned my tone or compared me to a woman I had barely begun to grieve. My relationship with my father dwindled to polite holiday texts and the occasional forwarded article he thought I might like. We hadn't had a real conversation in years, and honestly I preferred it that way. He had his world with Vanessa, I had mine. But time has a strange way of making you question your own decisions, even the healthy ones. And when the invitation arrived, a glossy email from Vanessa, of course for my father's 60th birthday dinner, I hesitated. I stared at the message for days before replying. Not because I wanted to go, but because some quiet part of me wondered maybe it would be different now. Maybe we could sit at a table and pretend just for one night that we were something close to family. I knew it was foolish. I knew exactly who I was dealing with. But I also knew what it felt like to wonder what if. So I booked a flight, reserved a small Airbnb downtown, bought a simple navy dress and a decent bottle of wine. Not for them. For myself, for the version of me that wanted to believe in second chances. Spoiler, that version of me didn't make it past the main course. The restaurant was one of those trendy downtown spots with Edison bulbs hanging from the ceiling and moss growing in picture frames on the walls. Everything about it screamed curated warmth, the kind of place where people pretend things are fine even when they aren't. I arrived 10 minutes early. The hostess led me to a private dining room in the back where a long table was already set with too many forks and named cards written in elegant calligraphy. Mine was at the far end next to Haley. I hadn't seen her in years. She looked different. A little more tired, maybe. A little less polished. She gave me a small smile when I sat down and I returned it with one of my own. It was the most honest exchange of the evening. The rest of the party filtered in slowly. Vanessa air kissed both sides of my cheek and called me sweetheart like we hadn't spent a decade avoiding each other. My father hugged me quickly, more like a formality than a greeting. Dinner was civil, tense in that overly polite way. People clinked glasses and complimented the wine. Vanessa recounted some story about a beach trip they took without bothering to include that I wasn't invited. My father chuckled along. Halfway through the meal, I excused myself to use the restroom. On the way back, I shifted slightly to avoid a waiter carrying a large tray. In doing so, I accidentally brushed into the back of Vanessa's chair. Just a light bump, nothing spilled, nothing dramatic. She turned her head slowly. Our eyes met. Then, with the kind of precision you only get from years of practice, she raised her hand and slapped me. Hard, right across the face. The sound echoed. The entire room froze. Every head at the table turned. Conversations died. Forks dropped. And in the stunned silence that followed, she leaned in close and whispered, "You're just like your mother." I didn't say a word. I looked at my father. He was staring into his plate like it held the secrets of the universe. He didn't look up, didn't flinch, didn't ask what had just happened. That silence, that total refusal to acknowledge what had just happened, was louder than the slap. So I stood up. I walked out. No one followed, not even Haley. I walked through the parking lot, down the street, back to my car, and sat behind the wheel in complete silence. I didn't cry. I didn't call anyone. I didn't scream. I just sat there, perfectly still, staring at the steering wheel, feeling something old and tangled finally begin to unravel. And then I went back to the Airbnb, opened my laptop, and started typing. At first, I was just venting. I opened a blank document and started typing, not for anyone else, just for me. I wrote about the dinner, the slap, the silence, the years of manipulation, of being dismissed, of swallowing my truth because telling it never made a difference. But as the words poured out, I realized something. I wasn't writing just to process. I was writing to reclaim my voice. So I opened Reddit. I'd been lurking on a subreddit called r raised by Narcissists for years, quietly reading posts that felt far too familiar. Stories from people like me, people who had been told they were too sensitive, too emotional, too much, when in reality, they were simply surviving the impossible. I created a throwaway account, changed the names, left out identifying details, then I posted it all. The title was simple: She slapped me at my father's birthday dinner, and he did nothing. I didn't expect much, maybe a few upvotes, a kind comment or two telling me I wasn't overreacting. Instead, it exploded. Within hours, there were hundreds of comments, thousands of upvotes. People from all over the world shared their own stories. People validated mine. Strangers told me I was strong, that I wasn't crazy, that my silence all those years wasn't weakness, it was survival. And then came the message. Just a few words, no profile picture, no flair. Olivia, I know it's you. I read your post. I believe everything. Can we talk? It was from Haley. For a second, I couldn't breathe. I stared at the screen, heart pounding. Then I typed back. Tell me when and where. We met the next morning at a small cafe near Powell's Books. I'd been bracing for awkwardness, for deflection, but Haley showed up in an oversized hoodie and no makeup. She looked like she hadn't slept. And when she sat down across from me, she didn't waste time. I saw everything that night, she said. And I think it's time we stop pretending she didn't show us who she really is. And just like that, the girl who had once been my rival became my ally. We sat in that cafe for over 2 hours. It wasn't small talk. It wasn't polite catch-up. It was raw, uncomfortable honesty, the kind that only happens when two people realize they've been living versions of the same story. I used to think you hated me, Haley said, stirring her cold coffee. But now I realize you were surviving, just like I was. I didn't know how to respond at first. For years, I'd viewed her as the favorite, the chosen one, the girl who got hugs while I got lectures. But the more she spoke, the more I saw at the cracks in her story, the fear she'd been too afraid to name. She always made me feel like I was the reason she was stressed, Haley said. Like if I could just be perfect, things would stay calm. But they never did they? I shook my head. Vanessa's control wasn't just about discipline. It was about manipulation. She needed to be the center of everything, and the rest of us were cast accordingly. I was the rebel. Haley was the good one. My father was the quiet background character who rarely challenged the script. Until that dinner. Something about the way Vanessa slapped me publicly, without shame, had shaken something in Haley too. She showed everyone who she really is that night, she said quietly. I think I always knew, deep down. But seeing it, I couldn't unsee it. That was when we made a decision. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't even about making her pay. It was about the truth. We went back through old messages, emails, screenshots. I still had the Dropbox folder I'd kept for years filled with photos, notes, even a letter I'd found from my mother after the funeral. Haley contributed what she had, including a text from Vanessa that made my stomach turn. We printed everything. And when my father and Vanessa returned home later that night, laughing, tipsy, unaware, they didn't expect to find us sitting calmly in the living room, or the thick folder waiting for them on the coffee table. This time, we weren't going to be quiet. They walked through the front door laughing. Vanessa was mid-sentence, probably embellishing some version of the dinner where I'd stormed off for no reason. My father followed a few steps behind, distracted, maybe a little drunk. But when they saw us, Haley and me, seated in the living room with a thick folder open on the coffee table, the laughter stopped. The air in the room shifted. "Olivia," my father said, his hand still on the doorknob. Vanessa froze. She didn't need to ask what the folder was. She knew. You could see it in the way her eyes scanned the room, the way her posture stiffened. She was calculating, not scared, just assessing. "What is this?" my father asked, walking slowly toward the table. Haley stood beside me. She wasn't shaking, but I could see the tension in her jaw. "You need to read it," she said. He sat down slowly and picked up the first page. It was a printed copy of the Reddit post. Names redacted. But the truth was all there: the slap, the history, the silence. He read in silence. His face shifted from confusion to something like recognition, then to a pale, sickly gray. Vanessa crossed her arms. "This is absurd," she snapped. "She's always been like this, dramatic, vindictive, obsessed with dragging me through the mud." I didn't respond. Haley reached over and flipped to the next page. A screenshot of a text Vanessa had sent her 2 years ago. "Your sister will always be a problem until your father sees her for what she is, an ungrateful version of her dying mother." My father read it twice. His hands tightened on the paper. Vanessa flinched. "That was taken out of context," she said quickly. "It was a joke. A bad one." "Do I look like I'm laughing?" Haley said, her voice flat and cold. The next pages were older. Letters from my mother. Notes she had hidden in a jewelry box I found after the funeral. In one, she wrote about Vanessa, how quickly their friendship with my father had grown too personal, how she felt something was wrong, how she was afraid for me. My father said nothing. He just sat there, eyes locked on the paper, face hollow. Vanessa tried again. "She's poisoning you," she said, pointing at me. "She's always resented me. She came back for your birthday just to pull this stunt." Haley cut in. "She didn't slap herself, Vanessa." That hit harder than anything I could have said. And then Vanessa turned on her daughter. "You're just siding with her because you've always been jealous. I've seen how cold you've been lately." I watched the switch happen from defensive to offensive, the manipulation she'd used on us for years. But Haley didn't flinch. "That night was the first time I saw who you really are. And you didn't even try to hide it." My father stood up. Slowly, his voice was soft but sharp. "You told me Olivia was exaggerating, that she was difficult, that she left because she couldn't handle things." He paused. Then added, "But she left because of you." Vanessa's face twisted. "She left because she couldn't stand not being the center of your world." No one said a word. She picked up her purse. "This is pathetic," she said. "I'm done here." She slammed the door behind her. And for the first time in a very long time, the house was quiet in a different way. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the kind of silence that buzzes in your ears, where even the sound of the refrigerator humming in the kitchen feels deafening. My father sat down slowly, his hands folded between his knees, staring at the floor like it had answers he couldn't find. He looked older in that moment. Not just tired, worn down, like the years he'd spent avoiding the truth had finally caught up to him in one crushing wave. "I didn't know she said that to you," he murmured to Haley. "She said worse," Haley replied quietly. "I didn't keep it all." He turned to me next. His eyes were red, not with tears but something heavier: recognition, maybe. Regret. "You kept all of this to yourself for how long?" he asked. I shrugged. I stopped counting. He exhaled sharply, as if the weight of it had just landed. "I thought I was protecting us," he said, "by keeping the peace." "You weren't," I said gently. "You were protecting the problem." He didn't argue, just nodded slowly, still not meeting my eyes. It would have been easy in that moment to lash out, to say "I told you so," to unload all the anger I'd been carrying for years. But I didn't, because what I saw sitting across from me wasn't a villain. It was a man who had been asleep for too long and was only just waking up to the damage he allowed, to the daughters he abandoned. What surprised me most wasn't him. It was Haley. She didn't leave after Vanessa slammed the door. She stayed. She curled up on the armchair across from Dad, like she used to when she was a kid. I sat across from them, watching this strange moment unfold, 3 people who had pretended to be a family for years now sitting in a room, no longer pretending. "I don't know how to fix any of this," he finally said. "You don't," I replied. "That's not how it works." But maybe, just maybe, telling the truth was a place to start. That night, I didn't go back to my Airbnb. Haley offered me her guest room, and for the first time in years, I accepted something from her without hesitation. Her apartment was modest, a small space in a quiet neighborhood, warm in a way our childhood home never was. Framed postcards covered the walls. A knitted blanket rested on the couch. The air smelled like vanilla and old books. It felt lived in, safe. We stayed up until almost 2 a.m., lying on the couch, wrapped in separate blankets, but tangled in the same memories. "She always made me feel like I was the reason she was stressed," Haley said, staring at the ceiling. "Even when I was a kid, I thought I was messing everything up." I nodded. "She did that to all of us, especially Dad." "Do you think he really didn't see it?" she asked. I thought for a long moment before answering. I think he chose not to. Because seeing it meant admitting what he let happen. To us, to Mom. She didn't say anything after that. Just reached over and gently squeezed my hand. For the first time, we weren't rivals. We weren't versions of someone else's expectations. We were just survivors, 2 women raised under the same roof, finally speaking the same language. The days that followed were slow but necessary. I stayed in Portland longer than planned, working remotely from Haley's apartment, visiting Dad every couple of days. Vanessa had moved in with a friend across town. We didn't hear from her again. Dad never said much during those visits. But he was always cleaning, reorganizing bookshelves, wiping counters, fixing things that didn't need fixing. It was an apology, but it was something. And for now, that was enough. I used to think healing would feel like a movie ending clean, dramatic, tied up with a bow. But the truth, it's quieter than that, less satisfying maybe, but far more real. My father and I will probably never have the kind of relationship I used to dream about. There are things he can't undo, words he never said, silences he never broke. But now, at least there's honesty. And that's something. Haley and I talk more now, not every day but enough. We don't pretend we're best friends. We're rebuilding something slower, deeper, something that isn't built on roles we were forced to play, but on truth we chose to tell. Vanessa's absence left a strange hole in all of us, not because we missed her, but because of how much space she used to take up. Now that space is finally ours again. And me? I still work in publishing. I still edit other people's stories. But now I've started writing my own, not for revenge, not for pity, but for clarity. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop pretending. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt silenced, small, or erased, I see you. And I hope you'll share your truth too. Like, comment, and share if you're ready to let go of the silence. Your story matters. So does your voice.